The holidays. Time to gather with those we love. A time for good food and good friends. A time for family togetherness. A time for family fun. A time for family... dysfunction? No, that's not right. You guys, I'm trying to talk about love and togetherness at the holidays over here. Can we get it together? Can we at least make it through dinner? Can you pipe down? Pipe down! I said pipe down! That's better. But if your holidays seem more dysfunctional than fun, it might be time to set a new course, to create a new family culture. But don't worry, you're not alone. We all have a little holiday family dysfunction.
They say that love is blind. Scripture itself tells us that love covers a multitude of sins. But sometimes, when it comes to dealing with holiday family dysfunction, what we call love can really just be an unwillingness to deal with the brokenness. Right? And this is one of those things that's always easier to spot from the outside looking in. Right? It's always easier to see this happen in someone else's family or in a more remote part of your family than when it hits a little bit closer to home. Right? This is one of those things that it's like, man, I don't know why they keep doing that. Meanwhile, there's somebody looking at us going, man, I don't know why they keep doing that, right? It's easier for us to see the further away from it we are. A lot of times we don't deal with the brokenness that causes our family dysfunction simply because we don't see it. But most of the time when that happens, we don't see it because we have normalized it in the name of love. Right, well, I love them, and so it's just easier to let it be. Well, I love them, so I don't want to upset them. Or sometimes we kind of leapfrog it. Well, I love my mama, and I know if I deal with this, it's going to break mama's heart, and I don't want to do that, and so I just leave it alone. Which, that reality gets us back to those principles of family dysfunction we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. We want to look at them again, review them here at the outset. If you're following along in the YouVersion Bible app, they'll be there for you. You can jot some things down, fill in some blanks if that's helpful, and take some notes. But everything that's on the screen, all the scripture, all the teaching notes will be there in YouVersion. Just go to the events tab and you should find us there. But these three principles of family dysfunction, we've bumped into them now a couple of times, and so if you've been tracking with us through this series, hopefully they will sound familiar and not completely out of left field for you at this point. If you're just catching up today, then we'll try and encapsulate them very quickly for you. The first of these principles we've been looking at says that family dysfunction is the result of broken relationships. Right? The reason our families have these things, these tensions, this dysfunction, is because somewhere along the line, some relationships got broken. Somebody said that thing or did that thing, and it's just kind of never been dealt with, and so the relationship has fractured, and on a long enough timeline, it can become family dysfunction. What we said from that is the second principle then, that in a broken world, family dysfunction probably isn't optional. Right? If we're assuming what Scripture teaches, that the world is not as it should be, that sin and its effects have crashed into God's good world, and as a result, we are all broken people to some degree, then it means when you put broken people into relationships, eventually some of those relationships are going to get what? Broken. And so in a broken world, family dysfunction probably isn't optional. But what we've been seeing through the course of the series is that normalizing it is. Right? That's the hinge point. We probably can't do anything about the fact that we're broken people, and so sometimes along the way we're going to bump into one another, and the relationships that we have are going to get fractured, they're going to get broken. That's probably not optional. But normalizing that, treating it as if it is okay, ignoring it, that thing we talked about right before Thanksgiving, pushing it down, squeezing it in so we can just make it through dinner, right? That is optional. So that brings us to the third idea we've been exploring. It's to say that our family dysfunction can undo our family culture, or our family culture can undo our family dysfunction. Right? When we spend a long enough time squeezing it all down, pushing it down so we can just make it through dinner, normalizing the brokenness, pretty soon that will undo our family culture. And it becomes that's just the way we are. And so every time the holidays roll around, we all kind of grit our teeth and we breathe deeply because we just got to get through the day. And we normalize it. And it begins to undo our family culture. But the reverse of that is also true. If we craft the right kind of family culture built on the ways and words of Jesus, it can undo that dysfunction. It can begin to repair broken relationships, or at the very least, help us to heal through the brokenness. The dysfunction may not be optional. Normalizing it is. And when we normalize it, then our dysfunction begins to erode and undo our family culture. And hope of Christmas, the hope of the gospel, the hope of Jesus, his death and resurrection, is that things can be different. That our family culture can begin to undo our family dysfunction. And so today, we want to lean into kind of this second principle that we've been looking at. We want to lean into this idea that the world is broken, and so there are going to be broken people in broken relationships. That's probably going to mean there's going to be some dysfunction from time to time. Our lives, my life, your life, our families, my family, your family, none of them are going to be perfect this side of God's new creation. Right? Okay, so we know that. So that means that we have to lean into this idea that there's going to be brokenness, but we don't have to be okay with it. The gospel is precisely good news because it is transformative. And so what that means for us as the people of God, following the ways and words of Jesus, is that we don't have to get okay with things not being okay. We don't have to normalize it to the point where we're like, yeah, it's just how it is. We don't have to buy that. The gospel is better than that. The hope we have in Jesus is better than that. And the gospel means that as followers of Jesus, we have an opportunity to be a redemptive presence in the midst of the brokenness all around us. But to do that, it requires that we get really honest about where we've gotten okay with things not being okay. It requires us to get honest with the ways in which we normalize the brokenness and the dysfunction. And so we want to step back into Jacob's story today in the Old Testament book of Genesis. We'll come to that in a moment. If you're just stepping in and joining us today, I want to catch you up to speed. And if you've been tracking this the last couple weeks, I just want to make sure we have all the big parts of the story so far in front of us. Jacob is one of twin sons, born to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac himself is the child of promise, born to Abraham in his old age as the climax of God's covenant promise with Abraham that he would make him a great nation, that he would build him a family from nothing. You might remember Abraham's an older gentleman when that promise gets made. He's like 75, no kids, and God says, you're going to have a huge family. And so through some ups and downs, ins and outs, we won't take time to rehash again today, he tries a bunch of stuff, and it all kind of blows up in his face. But eventually, in his 90s, he and Sarah have a child of their own, Isaac. And Isaac marries Rebekah. And when she conceives, there's a jostling in her womb. And so she inquires of the Lord as to what this is about. She probably assumes something must be wrong. There are complications with this pregnancy. And in her attempts to find out what's happening, when she inquires of the word of the Lord comes to her that there are two babies in her womb. And that they are jostling with one another because they are two nations who will combat one another. And the prophetic word that came to Rebekah told her that the younger son would supplant his older brother. So as the story begins to unfold, we run into some more dysfunction. Because each parent, Isaac and Rebekah, chooses a favorite son. Isaac has a soft spot for his eldest son, Esau, while Rebekah favors Jacob. And in the shadow of this prophetic word that the younger will supplant the older, with the dysfunction of favoritism and family dynamics at play, these two boys' lives are set on course with one another amidst the dysfunction. Until the point that Jacob, who was born grasping his brother's heel, that's why he gets the name Jacob, the grasper, the schemer, until the point that Jacob, the grasper, trades for his brother's birthright. And with his mother's insistence, deceives his dying father into being given the patriarchal blessing that should have gone to Esau. Now, as you might imagine, that series of events did not sit well with Esau, which kind of sets up the next chapter of Jacob's story. The next leg of his story is defined by this moment of Esau's response. Let's step into the text. In Genesis chapter 27. Again, you can follow along on the screen or the YouVersion app. Open a Bible. Get the word in front of you. Let's look together at Genesis chapter 27. This is immediately on the heels of Jacob's deception and Esau begging his father for his blessing, and his father telling him, it's too late. It's been given to your brother. Verse 41 of Genesis 27. Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, the days of mourning my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. When Rebekah was told what her older son Esau had said, she sent her younger son Jacob and said to him, your brother Esau is consoling himself with the thought of killing you. Now then, my son, do what I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him for a while until your brother's fury subsides. And when your brother is no longer angry with you and forgets what you did to him, I'll send word for you to come back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day? Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. By the way, that's Esau's wives. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from the Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living. 28 verse 1. So Isaac called for Jacob and blessed him and commanded him, do not marry a Canaanite woman. Go at once to Padan Aram, to the house of your mother's father Bethuel. Take a wife for yourself there from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. May He give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now live as an alien, the land God gave to Abraham. Then Isaac sent Jacob on his way, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, son of Bethuel the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, who was the mother of Jacob and Esau. Now Esau learned that Isaac had blessed Jacob and had sent him to Padan Aram to take a wife from there, and that when he blessed him, he commanded him, "Do not marry a Canaanite woman," and that Jacob had obeyed his father and mother and had gone to Padan Aram. Esau then realized how displeasing the Canaanite women were to his father Isaac, so he went to Ishmael and married Mahalath, the daughter of Nebaioth, the daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, in addition to the wives he already had. So Esau, upon learning of his brother's deception, upon learning of the way in which his father has given away the blessing that should have been his, does what you do when you've learned to navigate the dysfunction of your family. He pushes it down. He squeezes it under the surface and grits his teeth. The days of mourning my father are near, and then I will kill my brother Jacob. In other words, not while Dad's alive. Swallow the anger. Swallow the rage. Swallow it all. And wait. Squeeze it down. Push it just beneath the surface. And keep the peace. We're going to come back to that idea in a couple weeks as we come to the end of this conversation. So kind of tuck that away, Esau's response here. Because for today, we have plenty of ground to cover between now and then with Jacob's story and the way it's going to unfold from here. Rebekah is told what Esau has said. She always has a way of overhearing things, right? Like she's the one that overheard Isaac tell Esau, "Go to the field, fix some food like I like, and when you come back, I'll give you my blessing because I'm about to die." And she's like, "Jacob, your dad just told your brother." Right? She overhears everything, and it always is prompting her to get in the middle of it. And so she hears what Esau has said. It's reported to her. And so she goes to Jacob and says, "Your brother is going to kill you. I need you to flee. Why should I lose you both in one day?" And it's a little ambiguous. We're not sure whether she means, why should I lose both you and Esau? That their relationship has now been fractured because her role in this has come out. Or if she means Jacob and his father Isaac. It's a little ambiguous. We're not sure. What we do know is whatever the meaning she has there, there's some broken relationships happening that continue to fuel the dysfunction. But Rebekah is smart enough to know that if Jacob just flees, Esau will go after him. And Isaac will suddenly start to put it all together. And so she goes to Isaac and says, "I can't abide these Hittite wives of our son Esau. What would we do if Jacob also married women from here? Life wouldn't even be worth living. Why don't we send him to my family, where he can find a wife among our own people?" Now, that's going to play well for Isaac, because when it came time for him to find a wife, the word of the Lord comes to Abraham and says, "Don't let him choose a wife from among the Canaanite women. Go back to your clan." And so Abraham sends his servant to the house of Bethuel to find Isaac a wife. And so Isaac goes, yeah, that's a good plan. It worked out really well for us. And so he calls Jacob in, and he blesses him with the full weight of the Abrahamic blessing. We can't miss how key that is, because the text is screaming at us. There is no question now who the line of promise belongs to. The promise, the covenant, will now go through Jacob's family. All of the promises of Abraham to be a great nation, a community of peoples, Isaac calls it. The land, intrinsic to the idea of God's covenant, is built into this blessing. And he blesses his son Jacob, and he sends him to Rebekah's family in Padan Aram. And Jacob goes. And when Esau learns what has happened, and learns how it was the presence of his Hittite wives that his mother used as the guise to send Jacob away, he realized the grief his family unit was causing the larger family. And so he goes to Ishmael, Isaac's half-brother, and finds himself a wife from among their own people as well. Still striving after the acceptance, still striving after the ownership of the family. And Jacob goes to Padan Aram with the full weight of the Abrahamic blessing. The promises will go through him now, and that's not just his father saying that. On his way to his uncle Laban's home, Jacob lays down in the night and has a dream, a vision of a stairway, a ladder reaching to heaven, and sees God standing at the top of the ladder, bequeathing to him his blessing, saying, Jacob, the promise now goes through you. And so, Jacob makes his way to the home of Bethuel, his mother's father. And more specifically now, the house of her brother Laban, who it seems is now the head of the household there. And his mission is to find a wife that will be acceptable to his folks back home. And as it turns out, Laban just so happens to have 2 daughters. So after Jacob has been with Laban for about a month, Laban approaches him and says, hey, you've been here a while. Things are going well. You're a good worker. What do you think about sticking around? I could use the help. I'd like to bring you on full time and keep you here. Name your wages. Jacob gets a blank check from his uncle Laban. Tell me what it will cost me for you to stay here. And if you remember the story, if you're familiar with it, it won't surprise you to hear that Jacob has, in this month with his uncle Laban, fallen in love with Laban's youngest daughter, Rachel. And so he says, here's what I'll ask. I will stay and work for you for 7 years if you will give me the hand of Rachel in marriage. And Laban's like, that's a really good deal. 7 years of labor is a bride price that is insane. So Laban probably can't shake on the deal fast enough, right? Deal, done. And so Jacob serves in the household of his uncle Laban for 7 years, and at the end of 7 years, and the text of Genesis tells us it went by like a day for Jacob because he was so in love with Rachel. At the end of 7 years comes time for the wedding. and under the darkness of night, with the help of a bridal veil and maybe an assist from the wine of the wedding feast, Laban pulls a scheme of his own. And he substitutes Leah, the older sister, for Rachel, the younger. Because he has a bit of a social dilemma on his hands. It's not proper if he marries off his younger daughter before her older sister. It would bring shame on her, and as a result, it would bring shame on him and upon their household. And well, we just can't have that. It's one of those moments that we're so used to reading the Bible like as high, lofty stuff that we kind of forget that this is like on the ground, real life, and there's some stuff that's hilarious. And this is one of those times where there's kind of a built-in joke, because Laban makes the switch and we're going, wait, like what? But it's late at night, it's dark, they've been drinking, celebrating the wedding feast, she's wearing a veil, and the text says, and when morning came, there was Leah. And it's too late. When she enters his bridal tent, the marriage is legally binding. When they consummate it, it is morally binding. And so, Jacob comes to Laban, incensed. What have you done? We had a deal. 7 years I've been working for you for the hand of Rachel. And Laban, always the opportunist, himself a schemer, says, I understand, but what are you going to do? I couldn't marry my younger daughter before her older sister. That wouldn't be proper. You've got to understand. You put me in a corner here. He says, but I'll tell you what. If you agree to work for me for another 7 years, I'll give you Rachel in marriage as well. And so Jacob, now backed into his own corner, still deeply in love with Rachel, agrees. Celebrates the wedding week, and then marries Rachel as well as Leah, and continues to work for his uncle Laban for 7 years. Now we're covering a lot of ground, and we're gonna double back to this part of the story next week because there's a lot we need to drill down into, particularly around the relationship of these two sisters. But Jacob continues to work for Laban. And eventually, both sisters, as well as their handmaids, again, we're going to tackle that story next week, but they produce children for Jacob, furthering some of the dysfunctions we've already seen in the family. And Jacob, at the end of his 14 years of service, when he was sent to his uncle Laban's house to find a wife and has found two, is ready to go home. But Laban comes to him because Laban is a smart guy. If you haven't figured it out, he reads the field pretty well. And he says, I can see that God's favor is on you. And I have been blessed because you're here. So what'll it take for you to stay? And Jacob says, look, I've been working for you for 7 years, and I have nothing to show for it except 2 wives and a bunch of kids. But I've not yet started my own household. My own fortune has not been built. I've been working for you for free for 14 years. And so they come to an arrangement. Laban again says, well, tell me what you want. What are your wages? He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to give me whatever your flocks and herds produce that are striped or spotted animals. Okay, so fully one-colored sheep and goats would be far more common. It's a genetics thing. But Jacob says, if you'll give me the spotted and the striped animals, I can begin to build my own fortune. I can begin to build my own household. I can begin to prepare to provide for my family going forward apart from you. And Laban says, sure, no problem. But before the deal is finalized, he separates out his flocks and herds, pulls all these striped and spotted critters, and shuffles them into the flocks of his sons, leaving Jacob with a herd full of one-colored animals. Because Laban, always the schemer, understands that one-colored animals are more likely to produce more one-colored animals. But Jacob's a seasoned herdsman. After all, he's got 14 years of experience now. And so he begins to selectively breed his own herd and produce multitudes of striped and spotted animals. And back as this story goes, these two schemers always trying to outdo one another, always trying to find the upper hand. Until the day comes that the word of the Lord comes to Jacob. It says, son, it's time to go back home. Remember that covenant promise? A key piece of it is the land that I promised to Abraham. It's time to go back home. Now remember, the deal was he was going to go and stay in Laban's household until what? Until Mom gives him the all clear. Mama hasn't said anything. But the word of the Lord comes to Jacob and tells him it's time to go home. And so he talks to his wives. He talks to Leah and to Rachel to confirm that they're willing to go with him, to leave their father's house. They're eager to. They seem to be a little tired of the dysfunction, quite honestly. They say, what is this place to us? You are our husband. We have our children. Now you have your flocks. Let's just go. And so they set out in the middle of the night because every time Jacob tries to leave, Laban has this knack for getting him to stay. And so they set off in the middle of the night, attempting to go back home. Laban catches up to them in the night, accuses Jacob of stealing from him. In reality, it was Rachel. She took some household idols that her father had. But Laban catches up, accuses them of stealing, and ultimately searches the entire camp for his stolen goods. And that's where we want to pick the story back up. Genesis 31. Genesis 31. Step back into this scene of Jacob and Laban. And begin in verse 36. So Jacob was angry and took Laban to task. What is my crime? He asked Laban. What sin have I committed against you that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your house. Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of us. I've been with you for years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, the cold at night, and the sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." Laban answered Jacob, "These women are my daughters. Their children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I. Let it serve as a witness between us." So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar, and he said to his relatives, "Gather some stones." So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar Saharath, and Jacob called it Gilead. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." That is why it was called Gilead. It was also called Mizpah, because he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is witness between you and me." Laban also said to Jacob, "Here is this heap, here is this pillar I have set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. And he offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. And they had eaten, and after they had eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters, and he blessed them. Then he left and returned home. There came this moment in Jacob's experience where the dysfunction had to stop. Where years of abuse and guilt and manipulation had to stop. And what brings him to this moment, I think, is instructive for us as the people of God, because in this moment, something has changed. Now, for him to be obedient to the word of the Lord, things have got to be different, and the dysfunction has to stop. He can either stay in the cycle he's in with Laban, or he can go back to the land that God promised to his ancestor Abraham and be obedient to the word of the Lord. In some ways, this scene is something we've alluded to throughout this conversation. This is the Thanksgiving when it all blew up. Right, it started with that annually, kind of passive-aggressive argument between your aunts over who has the best green bean casserole. But all of a sudden, it escalated and became about these like decades-old slights and grievances. And pretty soon, it all blew up. And all the stuff that everybody had normalized, that everybody had swallowed and gritted their teeth to make it through dinner over, comes rushing out. And everybody in the room knew that it was never really about the green bean casserole. But they'd all played along. Until now. And the dysfunction that had been normalized, that had been pushed down, had been accepted in the name of love, came to the surface. And we get a prime lesson in dealing with holiday family dysfunction. Again, it's there in the notes if you want to jot some things down. Got to refuse to let your love for dysfunctional people become a love for the dysfunction they produce. Refuse to let your love of dysfunctional people to become a love for the dysfunction they produce. Right? Because most of the time when we convince ourselves that we should normalize this stuff, that we should swallow it, that we should just keep the peace, we do it in the name of we love them, so we don't want to frustrate them, we don't want to upset, we don't want to deal with it. And the way that family dysfunction will undo your family culture is all of a sudden your love for dysfunctional people turns into a love of the dysfunction that they produce. It's easy to get so used to it that if we're not careful, we begin to crave it. We begin to thrive on that environment because we don't know how else to exist. We can come to these moments where we don't know how to be normal if things are normal. We don't know how to relate to one another if we're not doing it through gritted teeth and clenched fists. It's all we know. And so we convince ourselves that it's become the way we love one another. In Genesis 31 here, it all comes spilling out. Jacob's had enough. He says, what am I supposed to do? Show me my crime. We're all here. We're all listening. Show me what I have taken from you. Now Jacob, if we've been reading this story carefully, Jacob is not innocent in all of this, right? He's still the grasper. He's still the schemer. He has contributed to this cycle of dysfunction. But it's all come to a head. And Laban says, look, everything you have is mine. Your wives, my daughters. Your children, my grandchildren. The flocks you have, where did they come from? They came from my flocks, from my herds. In Genesis 31, it creates this complete parting of the ways. And sometimes that's necessary. Like, if we're honest, there come these moments where you just have to say, okay, the only way to end this is if we just end this. I don't think that should be our first or go-to response as the people of God. We'll say more in the next couple of weeks about that. But this becomes a parting of the ways, so much so that Jacob and Laban, the graspers, the schemers, swear to God to leave each other alone. Like, that is the level to which this dysfunction had risen. We have to make a legally binding contract and invoke the name of God that we will quit harassing each other. Some of y'all just breathed a sigh of relief because your Thanksgiving dinner just got a whole lot less weighty, right? We've never had to do that. But the hope of the gospel is better than that. And it gives us a way forward, even amidst dysfunction. But for the gospel to do its work in us and in our families, it's required to be this moment when the levee breaks and we get honest about all the stuff we're swallowing and all the stuff we've normalized, and we stop ignoring it in the name of love. We start to call it by name. We start to identify it as sin, first in our own hearts, long before we deal with it in someone else. But guys, the key to this is that you refuse to let your love for dysfunctional people turn into a love for the dysfunction they produce. where it just has to be normal. That's just the way it has to be. Invite the band to come back. Guys, until the kingdom comes, until everything is made new, there will always be broken people. To varying degrees, we will always be broken people. Which means there's going to be some broken relationships. Which probably means there's going to be some family dysfunction. It's probably not optional. But normalizing it absolutely is. And we all face these moments and these tensions where the things that have been pushed down, the things that we've just held on to, the things that we've normalized kind of want to bubble to the surface. And refusing to normalize it anymore becomes the first step towards healing. Becomes the first step towards crafting and shaping a new family culture that can begin to undo the family dysfunction. As we continue this conversation in the next couple of weeks, we want to explore some more of Jacob's story and find out what that looks like. But for today, the challenge that sits before all of us is to honestly search our hearts before the Lord and ask if there are ways that the dysfunction that we don't talk about, that we don't want to deal with, is rooted in the way that we've redefined it as love. I love them too much to bring it up, to deal with it. It's just easier if we just keep going like it is. Because I want you to know the good news is better than that. And it's painful, it's hard, it can be costly. But if we want to follow the ways and words of Jesus, we have to get okay coming to these moments that are uncomfortable, where we're faced with the same choice Jacob had. I can stay in the cycle of brokenness, keep contributing to the dysfunction, or I can be faithful and obedient to the word of the Lord. Let me pray for us.